Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Weeb Union, and in this one, starting out in the Kursk region, we have a Russian counterattack recapturing Snagost, Ukrainian presence north of Novoivanovka here in the central parts, and in the eastern parts north of Sucha, the Ukrainians have managed to advance further in the area of Poreshno. According to the report, it was first reported that a Ukrainian presence was detected and shot at within the village of Poreshno. Since then, it has further been reported that additional units of the Ukrainians have been detected in the general area. This indicates that the Russians, following their recapture of parts of the railways due to the Ukrainian counterattack here within Sucha, managed to recapture those positions yet again and then push beyond it in a northern direction. The connection between forces here from the western side and the southern side allowed them to move towards the northeastern sides. So we see a Ukrainian advance here in the northeastern parts. In the central parts, we previously saw footage of the Ukrainian convoy being shot here in the near area of the forest patch south of Kremyanoe, and there's also footage of Russians clearing the village of Kremyanoe itself further north, which indicates that the Ukrainians were pushed out after losses, forced to withdraw. This leads to the Ukrainians having control over the area just south of it. At the same time, there's geolocated footage of Ukrainian presence in the forest area here to the west. So we see that there is positional fighting in the north, and the Ukrainians had presence further north than was previously expected, but those have been expelled and pushed out of the area, and the Russians have recaptured Snagost here to the west, pushing the Ukrainians beyond the river line. This has allowed them to stabilize the front line here in the north. Based on this, we see that the Russians are actively present along the front line in this section of the area of the front line. This leads to the Russians having stabilized the western and northwestern and northern parts of the front line, leaving the northeastern, eastern, and southeastern parts unstable. The Russians do have a presence within Sucha, where they are heavily fighting both in the central parts and in the eastern outskirts, what parts that they do have left. And at the same time, there is Ukrainian significant presence here in the previously gray zone area north of Sucha. Following several Ukrainian pushes in this direction, it seems that the main push of the Ukrainians is coming in this direction based on the territorial changes. So we see that the Ukrainians are putting a lot of effort into this eastern area where they are trying to prevent the Russians from establishing their positions. There's also reports of counterattacks in the direction of Martinovka, where they're looking to regain control of it following the Russian recapture of the town. So we see heavy fighting along this road specifically because that is where the Russian reinforcements are going towards. It seems that the Ukrainians want to recapture Sucha, and the way they're doing so is in their attempt on doing so, they want to limit the Russian reinforcements as much as possible, and they do that with the positional fighting in the north. They simply cannot put more soldiers in Sucha because concentrating larger forces would just lead to more casualties from the Russian strikes. Therefore, the current fighting is at their limit, so they try to avoid the Russians from resupplying and sending reinforcements towards it to allow them to capture it. And they're doing this through this push to the north. The Ukrainian territorial gains in this area is about 48 square kilometers, and the Russians captured about 20 square kilometers. Further south here in the direction of Tabeivka, the Russians have advanced to the heights west of the village and gained control over several forest lines and the final parts of the fortified area northeast of Tabeivka. This has secured the southern flank of Kotlyarivka and northern flank of Tabeivka, connecting the two sides and showing several advances by the Russians here west of Tabeivka and north of Pishane. Following the capture of the fortified positions of the Ukrainians north of Pishane, the Russians have now consolidated their gains and are pushing here to flank the Ukrainian positions along the highway and push towards Pishane, and they're generally just advancing through the fields and forest areas east of the fortified positions, expanding the zone of control and developing offensive operations in the direction of Kupiansk. Further south here in the direction of Toretsk, we have significant Russian advances. Starting out in Pivnishne, the Russians have reached the outskirts of the village and the outskirts of Toretsk itself by reaching the auto repair shop here in between This marks the border between Pivnishne and Toretsk. Taking a closer look, the apartment complex area here just west of the auto repair shop, this area here is a defensive position of the Ukrainians. It is a fortified area. If the Russians gain control of it, they'll be able to fully control Pivnishne, as Pivnishne would be isolated from the Ukrainian positions within Toretsk itself. It'll overlook the fortified positions and hill of the second line of defense of the Ukrainians just east of it. At the same time, we also see that the hills here to the south of it and the industrial area are located right near it, which will strengthen the Russian efforts towards moving in that direction as well. Generally, gaining control over this will significantly improve the Russian positions here within Toretsk and lead to the situation completely switching from in favor of the Ukrainians to in favor of the Russians based on the defensive positions, because the Ukrainians simply do not have any fortified positions within Toretsk. They have these natural barriers based on the buildings that they have, which are mainly located around the apartment complex areas. We have this eastern parts, we have this central part, and then we have a western part in the industrial area right next to the central apartment complex area. So we see that these are the defensive positions of the Ukrainians within Toretsk. These are all based on what was previously built from the city itself, rather than the fortified positions. Therefore, we see that the Russians, if they manage to gain control over the apartment complex area here west of Pivnishne and secure the remaining parts of the second line of defense, they'll have gone through all of the Ukrainian fortified positions all the way until the central parts and western parts of Toretsk, where the Ukrainians would at that point be on the brink of losing the city itself, just similar to the current situation here by New York, where the remaining parts are the industrial area and the defensive area northwest of New York, which has then subsequently led to the Russian capture of almost the entirety of the 2014 line of defense. The situation was that the Russians managed to capture fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the northwestern parts of the city, which led to the endangerment of pretty much a complete collapse of the city of New York. The Ukrainians then led counterattacks in both of Russia's footholds in the northern parts of the river line, leading to the recapture of the fortified positions and the positions here in the eastern parts of New York to cover for a withdrawal of Ukrainian soldiers here in the east. This led to the Russians gaining control over this huge area east of New York of 2014 lines of defense without much of a fight. At the same time, here to the south of Selishne and Pivdene, the Ukrainians moved troops from that direction to help support and cover the withdrawal of the Ukrainians in the south, which then led to the Ukrainians abandoning their fortified positions in that direction as well, and led to further Russian advances in this direction. So we see that the Russians have managed to take advantage of their advances both within the Toretsk direction and New York direction to gain control over the 2014 line of defense without much of a battle. This leads to significant advances in areas that were heavily fortified and could have slowed down the Russians they have managed to slow down the Russians for 30 months. Based on these developments, we see that it is only a limited time that the Ukrainians remained to have control over Toretsk and New York. It is likely that the Russians will eventually end up with full control over both of these cities, as the Ukrainians simply wish to launch a Kursk offensive instead of helping them out in the east. In the direction of Penteley-Monivka, the village here west of New York, the Russians have advanced a bit further, developing their offensive operations in the direction of it. So we see fighting both in the direction of New York, Toretsk, and the area in between, as well as west of New York towards the Ukrainian villages in the area. We see consistent fighting by the Russians in this section of the front line, leading to several advances, and we see just this month the Russians have captured over 20 square kilometers in the New York and Toretsk section of the front line. In the direction of Vododara and Vodiane, the Russians have launched another assault towards the Ukrainian fortified positions just outside the road here in the central parts, following the cut off of the road here north of Vodiane towards Konstantinivka. The Russians are now looking to cut off the area by Vodiane, and then consolidating their gains here in the central parts, having a strong foothold within the road, and start developing offensive operations in the direction of Vodiane and north towards Konstantinivka. At the same time, it could also start threatening the Ukrainian positions in Volodar or the heights here just northeast of Volodar. The general situation right now is that the Russians continue their offensive operations in the east, pretty much everywhere where they were already launching operations. They have just continued these, while the Ukrainians launched their Kursk operation in the north. Since Ukraine has never really explained why they launched this offensive operation in the Kursk direction, a lot of people have speculated, both the Institute for Study of War, numerous Western articles, pretty much anyone analyzing this war has been thinking about what the Ukrainian objective is. Most land on it being an attempt by the Ukrainians to repeat the Russian Kharkiv offensive by sending troops into the Kursk region to prevent the Russians from continuing offensive operations in the east by spreading out their forces and forcing the Russians to relocate forces from the Kharkiv and eastern front towards the Kursk front. This, however, based on every single Russian source, unanimously have said practically no units from any other front has been sent to deal with the Kursk offensive. Pretty much not a single unit from the east or from Kharkiv has been sent to the Sumy region. There are reserves in the Belgorod region which were sent to the Kharkiv region from the Sever group, the north group of Russian armed forces, but these were already dedicated to a Sumy offensive, not the Kharkiv offensive, and these are the units being sent to deal with the Kursk offensive. As was mentioned ahead of the Russian Kharkiv offensive, the Russians had about 50,000 soldiers concentrated in the Belgorod region, of which only about 10,000 have entered Kharkiv. This means there would still be 40,000 left. Let's say an additional 5 to 10,000 entered, that would still leave 30,000 left in the Belgorod region. 30,000 is more than enough for the Russians to defend against the Ukrainian offensive, as their number somewhere between 10 to 30,000 troops as well. So at a 1-to-1 comparative positioning, the Russians or the Ukrainians could do a bit of back and forth, but whoever's on defense would have the advantage. That means as long as the Ukrainians are on the offensive, the Russians have more than enough troops to deal with that. Therefore, there's no reason for the Russians to relocate troops in this section of the front line in the Kursk direction. Based on this, I will conclude that there is no correlation between that objective and the situation on the ground. If this is the objective of the Ukrainians, then that objective will not be reached with this offensive. Instead, what I believe from the first day until now is that this is a Ukrainian preemptive strike on the Russians ahead of them launching their offensive, to try and catch them off guard, to try and get some sort of advantage that they would not be able to get if they were simply staying on the defensive. They believe that with their elite forces, the best trained, best equipped forces that they have built up over the last year, they would be able to gain some sort of massive victory, destroy the Russian army ahead of them entering, something like that. But it has so far seemed that there is no advantage to the Ukrainians at all in terms of casualties, especially since they are on the offensive. This leads to raise the question, what exactly is the objective? Because what they're doing right now does not correspond to any of the objectives that have been mentioned. If anything, it looks more like there is no objective than there actually being one. It could be that the objective is simply to advance as much as possible and then try to hold it. To what cause, to what strategic objective, there is none. There is one Western article that mentioned maybe, just maybe, the Ukrainian objective is to wreak as much havoc as possible, to embarrass Putin, and that's it. Maybe that is their entire objective. And that would actually be in line with what the Ukrainians are doing. They believe more in PR than in actually fighting the war, for some reason. And that is the fatal flaw of the Ukrainians in this war, is that they believe PR matters more than anything else. And it really looks like this is just some PR operation where they want to, quote, embarrass Putin, end quote, which makes absolutely no sense, because how is this embarrassing for Putin? How is this embarrassing for anyone, really? if Russia launched a offensive with 10,000 elite soldiers into any country in the Western Hemisphere, they would likely see similar results to this. It is not embarrassing in any way, shape, or form. It is simply just twisted thinking, and it has no relation or correspondence to reality, what they're doing. But if you do know what their objective is and why that objective is important and reasonable enough for them to be wasting 20,000 elite soldiers, please do explain in the comments down below. I'll make sure to read and comment on them if there's something reasonable about it. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.